I recently had my 8-year anniversary of living in the US, and yes, living abroad for such a long time changes you in many ways. Today, I want to talk about how these last 8 years have affected the way I see my home country, Germany. Hello, servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio, on and off since 2016. Since August 13th, 2016 to be exact, because that's the day I got on a plane from Munich to Paris and then from Paris to Cincinnati, heading into 5 months of unknown adventure for an exchange semester. I had no clue who my roommates were going to be. I didn't know what my classes were gonna be like, if I was gonna make any friends, or what my everyday life would look like. But I ended up having the time of my life, to say it in the most corny way possible, and I decided to come back to the US as soon as I could. So after about 8 months in Germany, I returned for a 6-month internship, then went back to Germany again for a few months, and returned to get my master's degree at the University of Cincinnati in 2018. Since then, I've lived here permanently, and that has definitely shaped me. Over the years, I've started to see my home country, Germany, in a whole new way, for example, because I had a different perspective now. At the beginning, I actually mainly started to see things that I didn't like so much about Germany. Things where I was like, oh, there's a way of doing this that's different from what I grew up with and what I considered normal my whole life. And I think I might like this way a little bit better. But then the longer I stayed here, the more I also started to appreciate many things about Germany that I always took for granted growing up there. So let's talk about the things I started to dislike first, and then we'll get to the positive things afterwards. This video is going to be a little bit more casual, especially compared to the last one I posted on here. So feel free to just grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and please keep in mind that this video will only represent my personal experiences and opinions. But of course, every person has their own experiences and different preferences. I mean, it would be boring if we were all the same. So if you disagree with me on any of these things, please feel free to share that with everyone in the comments below. I think the first thing I noticed about the US was how positive and uplifting most people here were. And coming from the German culture, it took me a while to get used to that, but I think after a couple of months, I had kind of deciphered the friendly small talk and compliments and the support that people here show for each other, and understood the deeper layer behind it that is often perceived as superficial or fake by us Germans, and I started to really appreciate it. In return, I had a pretty strong case of reverse culture shock when I first came back to Germany after 5 months in the US, and I really noticed how different interactions are when you're out in public or even in one-on-one conversations. Like having people at the store just step right in front of me to grab something out of the shelf, even touching me without even saying excuse me. Or store employees talking to me in a tone that made it seem like I was an inconvenience to them, and I wouldn't even get a smile back or a simple have a nice day. Not that every store employee is like that in Germany, but it's not uncommon. And of course, I knew that this was normal in Germany, just a neutral interaction. But having my US glasses on, metaphorically, it suddenly didn't feel normal anymore, and it actually kind of affected my mood. So I would say the lack of small talk and just friendly conversations in everyday life are actually something that I've come to dislike when I'm in Germany. Maybe I wouldn't need it quite as much as in the US, because as a true German, I still want grocery shopping to be quick and efficient. But just being nice to each other, giving people a random compliment, and having fun little banter here and there really couldn't hurt. I talked about this a little bit more in detail in my video about things I would change about Germany if I could, but to me, it sometimes almost feels like Germany is stuck in that teenager phase where, you know, it's uncool to smile or be too nice to each other, and you automatically find something bad about everything your parents do or say. Except in this case, it's not just your parents. Germans somehow have the superpower to find something negative about pretty much everything. It's a beautiful summer day. Oh, it's too hot. Someone has a big new house. Yeah, it's nice and all, but I wouldn't want to pay their electricity bill. And of course, the biggest compliment by a German is, da kann man echt nicht meckern. You really can't complain about that. Okay, I am exaggerating a bit, but there is some truth to this. And before I moved to the US, I didn't even realize I had this kind of pessimistic way of thinking ingrained in me. Another thing I started to dislike about social life in Germany is the fact that most people aren't very spontaneous, and this has gotten even worse the older we get. Just to give you an example, I turned 30 earlier this year, and I celebrated together with a childhood friend in Munich. The party was in March, we started planning in January, and my friend, who still lives in Germany, kept telling me how we really need to start inviting people because most of them will already have plans for that weekend now. And she told me how some of her friends were already planning their 30th birthday party in November. And I was like, well, in the US, inviting people 2 months ahead is almost too early for something like that. You're gonna have to remind them about it again 2 weeks before. That's my experience at least, and my American friends here are about the same age overall. Just this past Friday, I went to a surprise going away party for a friend, and I was first told that it was probably happening a week before, and then got the official invitation the day before. And there were still over 20 people that showed up. And some of the best times I've had here in the US happened completely last minute. In Germany, I've been asked before if I'm free for brunch on a Sunday 6 weeks from now, and while I know that many people love planning ahead like that, it's just not for me. I mean, a lot can happen in 6 weeks, so ask me again like the week of. So while I know that a lot of people prefer it like this, it's definitely going to be something I don't look forward to when Ben and I move to Germany next year, which is our plan. Now, this is something I could only dream of when I was a teenager learning English in school. Learning your second language while watching TV. LingoPie was created specifically for this purpose, which means that you can watch shows, movies, documentaries, or even music videos while having bilingual subtitles turned on. And whenever you don't understand something, you just click on the word for an immediate translation.
Der Wald.
Or you can go back in the script if you missed something, jump back and forth, loop a sentence, or listen to everything at a lower pace depending on your language level. Because we all know that foreign languages sound like they're being spoken at 100 miles per hour at the beginning. It'll get better over time, I promise. But until then, you can just use the speed function. If you turn on the grammar index, it'll show you the different elements of the sentence with colors. And if you click here, you'll get further explanations on the vocab and grammar of the sentence. There's even a recording tool that lets you practice your pronunciation, and you can save new vocab to your flashcards so that you can quiz yourself afterwards. But if you want, you can also just relax and watch. LingoPie has content libraries in 9 different languages. This includes Spanish, French, Italian, but also Chinese, for example, or Korean, and of course, German. With the Netflix extension, you can even use the LingoPie tools while watching your favorite Netflix shows. I absolutely loved the German show Dark, for example, How to Sell Drugs Online Fast, Biohackers, those are all shows I'd recommend. They also have the Oscar-winning movie All Quiet on the Western Front. They have classic German kids shows like Die Pfefferkörner, The Peppercorns, or Pettersson und Findus. Great music videos. Definitely check out Anne mein Kantereit. And of course, language learning videos. So if you want to try LingoPie yourself, just click the link in the description below to start a 7-day free trial and get an exclusive discount and just enjoy watching TV while improving your language skills. One thing that never really stood out to me when I still lived in Germany was the smoking, but now I notice it a lot. Granted, it's not just Germany, it's most European countries actually, but smoking cigarettes, especially in public, is something that you don't see a lot in the US, at least not anymore. Like, you don't really see ashtrays on tables at outdoor restaurants, and even in front of clubs and bars, there aren't usually a lot of people smoking cigarettes here in the US, if any at all. The latest numbers I could find for the US were from 2021, where it was 11.5% of adults who smoked cigarettes, while in Germany, it's currently still about 20%. I mean, smoking in Germany has definitely declined over the last few decades, but it's still very present in society. Even train stations and airports usually have designated smoking areas, which isn't usually the case in the US. So when you go out to a club in Germany, I'd say it's pretty normal that you'll come home smelling like cigarettes, even if you yourself don't smoke at all. Also, every time I go back home, I'm reminded of how bad the internet can be in Germany. Are we a developed country? Yes, for the most part, but we totally missed the train when it comes to investing in our internet infrastructure and digitalization in general. In this international ranking of internet speeds, Germany ranks number 58, behind countries like Latvia, Costa Rica, Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago, and many others. The US ranks number 5 on this list. And when it comes to bureaucracy, a lot of industries in Germany still work with paper letters, fax machines, and have tons and tons of filing cabinets full of paper printouts. When I recently sent an email to my German health insurance, for example, I got the response as a physical letter in the mail. This one I've talked about a lot in the past, and I already briefly touched on it earlier, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail today, but now that I know what customer service can look like, German customer service is kind of forever ruined for me. And I know that many Germans don't actually like American customer service because they find it to be too much. And I get that. And I know that many people will say that customer service in the US is only better because the workers here aren't paid real wages and have to rely on getting tipped, which is true and also a fair point. But I experienced this overall friendliness even in situations where the workers don't get tipped at all, like at a coffee shop, for example. People here are just genuinely friendly and accommodating for the most part, while in Germany, and some other European countries too, it definitely happens that store employees just give you the feeling that your sole presence is bothering them. And now that I know that it doesn't have to be like that, I just always ask myself, why? Like, do you hate your job that much? And if so, do you really have to take it out on me? What's so hard about just being nice to one another? I mean, I think it goes back to the overall customer service mentality in Germany. Like, you never received overly friendly customer service, so now you're not doing it yourself. But I just don't understand why that has to be the standard. Another thing I noticed about Germany is that compared to how things work in the US, a lot of areas of life have a pretty high entry threshold. Like starting a business, for example, is very bureaucratic in Germany, and depending on the business form, it requires a certain amount of starting capital, and then this whole process can be pretty intimidating to people and isn't very intuitive to figure out. Same thing goes for buying real estate, for example. Just to sign the purchasing contract, you have to go to a notary who reads out the entire contract to you, and it'll cost you about 1.5% of the purchasing price. So if you're buying real estate for 500,000 euros, that will be 7,500 euros just for the notary. When we bought our house here in the US, the process was very simple and quick. The appointment took like 20 minutes, and the seller is the one paying for all the closing fees. But as far as I know, those fees don't even mainly go to the notary at the title office. Even learning a new skill or profession can have a really high entry threshold in Germany due to the fact that most professions are strictly regulated and you need to have completed 3 whole years of training before you can work in it, which has a lot of benefits too, of course, but it just sometimes makes things seem very hard to access in Germany. While in the US, this whole idea of the American dream, to me, seems to be a little bit more accessible, at least in terms of the bureaucratic thresholds. The next thing I wrote down on my list is that everyone is supposed to follow certain expectations in Germany, which I think is kind of connected to the fact that Germany tends to have more of a collective society model, while American society tends to be more individualistic. So after being in the US for such a long time, I just feel like Germans don't really give each other a whole lot of room to live a life that's a little bit different from the mainstream. Dressing differently, for example, or decorating your car differently, or your yard, or just choosing a different course of life than most people would. I mean, you have the freedom to do so, of course, but I don't think Germans are very used to that, and there will immediately be questions like, why would you do that? And there will be comments that can often be pretty judgmental, even if the other person's choice doesn't even affect you in the slightest. And I think in some cases, this judgment just goes back to people not being used to something and finding it hard to relate. In other cases, I think it even comes from a place of love and concern. Like one of my friends quit her job 2 years ago to go travel around Central America for a few months, and most people in her family didn't react with, wow, what a cool idea, but instead said things like, oh my God, are you sure? What about your job security? And while being from that country, I understand where they're coming from, of course, it's just not really something that I appreciate a whole lot anymore. And last but not least, I always notice the lack of personal space now when I'm in Germany. Of course, that's nobody's fault really, that's just due to how densely populated the country is. But I've been so spoiled with having all this space here in the US that it has started to stress me out a lot more when I'm in completely overcrowded stores in Germany where I have people touching me on all sides, or when I'm in a changing room and there's barely even space for me to turn around. And of course, how small the houses and apartments are, especially if you live in a city, is just completely different from how I live here in the Midwest, where it's normal to have a single family house, not a townhouse, not a duplex, with a front yard, backyard, patio, porch, and garage. Now, on the other hand, life in the US has also made me start to appreciate things about life in Germany that I had never even really thought about before. Things that I always considered normal, but now I know that that's not always the case, even in a developed country like the US. That includes safety, for example. Like, I never even owned a pepper spray until I moved here, and I'd also never heard a gunshot before. And when people here told me at first that I shouldn't walk 5 minutes home after dark, I thought they were being dramatic, but when you hear about armed robberies in your own neighborhood, or kids being shot in public in broad daylight, and even know people who've been attacked and robbed in your city, it starts to get to you. And well, I don't go out alone after dark anymore here, whereas in Munich, I feel perfectly safe taking the subway alone at night and riding my bike through the woods at 2 a.m. Now, some of you might be wondering, hasn't the crime rate gone up in Germany over the last few years? I mean, it has a little. It's still lower than it was 10 years ago, but it has gone back up from where it was in 2021. However, it's still significantly lower than it is here in the US. If you look at the intentional homicide rate, for example, which is often used as an indicator for the overall crime of a country, the rate was at 6.4 homicides per 100,000 people in the US in 2022, while in Germany, it was at only 0.8 per 100,000 people in the same year. So that's about 1/6 of the homicide rate per capita compared to the US. By the way, if you're curious to hear more about my immediate experiences with gun violence here in the US, I talked about it a little more in detail on my podcast a couple of years ago. I'll link that up here for you guys. I've also really come to appreciate the German healthcare system, especially when I hear about Americans who got sick and have hundreds of thousands of dollars, or even more than that, in medical debt, and then they have to start a GoFundMe page for that, or their family have to deal with this for years to come. That's such an insanely high burden to pay just to be able to survive. Or let's talk about the fact that a lot of Americans are scared of calling an ambulance in an emergency situation because they can't afford to pay $2,000 for that. In comparison, on my recent group trip to Germany, we actually had one person that rolled their ankle while we were on a walking tour through Nuremberg, and we ended up calling the ambulance, and this was the total bill we received for it. Giving birth can cost you tens of thousands of dollars in the US too, even with health insurance in a lot of cases. Because you often have to pay big out-of-pocket deductibles, even when you already pay hundreds of dollars every month for health insurance. And then you can only go to certain hospitals and doctors that are in network of your insurance. We were recently looking for a dermatologist in the Cincinnati area that takes Medicaid insurance, for example, which is like the most basic public health insurance for low-income people. And there were only 2 dermatologists in the entire area that even take that insurance, and they weren't accepting new patients. And then, of course, dental insurance isn't even usually part of your normal health insurance here. Meanwhile, I grew up in a society where it's considered totally normal to go to the dentist 1 to 2 times a year, no matter your income class. And I had never heard of medical debt in my life before I moved to the US, so those are just things that I don't take for granted anymore now. Of course, there's a lot to criticize about the German healthcare system too, but hey, compared to the system in the US, it's pretty amazing. Same goes for the access to education. How great is it that it's not expected for parents to pay tens of thousands of dollars to send their kids to private schools just so they can then make it into a good university? that will also cost tens of thousands, if not over $100,000 a year. That's a financial burden that's just crazy for families and young adults. So knowing that that's normal here in the US, I'm so glad now that in Germany you can attend even the best universities for a few €100 per semester. I also never considered the workers' rights in Germany to be anything special until I found out that a lot of Americans only get 10 days of paid vacation leave a year and have a limited amount of paid sick days, often around 5 a year, and if they're sick for longer than that, they won't get paid. In Germany, 20 paid vacation days a year are mandatory by law, but most employers give at least 30, and if you're sick, you can stay home until you feel better. There's no limit. Unless you get sick for several weeks at a time, but even then, you'll still get a percentage of your salary. And don't even get me started on maternity leave. In Germany, women are not only allowed to stay home, but have to stay home from work 6 weeks prior to the estimated due date and 8 weeks after, and that is paid leave. In addition to that, both parents can take parental leave of up to 3 years each, during which they won't get paid, but they can't be fired during this and have a right to return to their old job afterwards. In the US, women can legally take up to 12 weeks of unpaid maternity leave per year. Some employers do offer paid leave, but I've encountered several pregnant women here who basically worked until the day they gave birth and then used up all of their paid vacation time, not maternity leave, paid vacation time, to be able to stay home with the baby and still have an income. And then after those 12 weeks are up, they can be fired if they don't come back to work. Now, I know that I kind of criticized a lot about the social aspects of life in Germany, but something that I've really come to appreciate over the years is German honesty, as well as how loyal and reliable German friends are. I know that it can be a lot harder to make new friends in Germany, but once you are friends with people, they often consider you friends for life and will be there for you whenever you need them. Now, of course, that's something that you can find in the US as well, but for the most part, I feel like Americans spend time with their friends while they're physically close, but then once they move to a new city, they don't consider it their duty to check in on each other regularly, which is kind of how Germans handle their friendships. So even though I haven't lived there in 8 years now, my closest friends are still my friends in Germany. Okay, this next one is a fun one because I know that most Germans will probably disagree with this, and it is that I really appreciate German drivers and how they actually follow the rules, like the Rechtsfahrgebot on the Autobahn, to only use the left lane for passing and then getting back over, or how well they do the zipper merge, the Reißverschlussverfahren. And to the Germans watching, I know you're gonna be like, I wish that was true, Feli, but it really isn't. You don't know what you have until you lose it, okay? They don't even teach the zipper merge here for the most part. So people get over hundreds of meters before a lane even closes and cause a whole lot of backup traffic instead of just using the lane until it actually ends. And then they consider the few people who do it right and actually drive until the end of the lane, which if all cars did that would reduce the traffic for everyone. They consider them people who cut in line. So while I do think it's ridiculous that driving schools cost upwards of 3,000 euros in Germany, I am very thankful for the good driving skills on German roads. The last thing I put on my list that I never even noticed about the German mentality before is how frugal Germans are. And here's what I mean by that. So while in the US, consumerism is very omnipresent and people often just spend money on things without even questioning if it's worth that much, and they even spend money that they don't actually have by putting it on their credit cards, most people in Germany just have this built-in mentality of weighing out your options before buying something. Like people look at the Preis-Leistungs-Verhältnis, so the cost-benefit ratio of things, and often put saving money over convenience. Like when Americans would maybe just say, what? Parking at the baseball game costs $20? Well, I guess it is what it is. Many Germans would probably prefer to park somewhere cheap and then walk for 30 minutes, just out of principle. And this also applies to a lot of Germans who have a pretty good income, who could technically afford all of that, but overpaying for things when it's not necessary just kind of rubs a lot of us the wrong way. One of the biggest German electronics stores, Saturn, even had the phrase Geiz ist geil as their slogan for the longest time, which means stinginess is awesome. If I had to guess, I'd say that some of this probably probably still goes back to the mindset of the time period during and after World War II, when many Germans barely had enough food to survive. And I actually kind of like that I have that mentality in me and don't just blindly accept that groceries for 2 people cost upwards of $700 a month here in Cincinnati, and that I at least make an effort to get certain essentials at cheaper places like Aldi. And overall, I feel like this mindset is the reason why I've always been pretty responsible with my money without having to actively think about it. And I've also kept that German mindset that having debt is like a big red flag, so I would never really buy anything that I couldn't afford. Mom, can we stop by McDonald's on the way home, please? No, honey, we still have bread at home. So shout out to German stinginess. That was everything I had on my list for today of things that I've started to see differently about Germany in the last few years. But there's one thing that doesn't really have to do with Germany itself, but more like with my identity. And that is when I first came here, people would sometimes say something like, "Oh, you're European," or "You're from Germany? That's so cool. I've always wanted to go to Europe." And that felt super weird to me at first because I never really identified as European per se. I identified as German, maybe Bavarian, but like Europe includes so many vastly different countries, right? So it felt kind of weird hearing people refer to it like it's a different planet or as if it's just one big country. But over the years, I've realized that a lot of European countries do actually have a lot in common with each other when you compare them to the US. So when I'm here, I do now identify as a European, and when I meet people from other European countries here, I do somehow feel like they have something in common with me, even if we didn't grow up in the same country at all. Now that I've shared my personal takes on this topic, what's something that you never even thought twice about in regards to your home country, but at one point you suddenly changed your perspective about it, whether it was in a positive or a negative way? Let me know in the comments below, and of course don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for free if you like what I do on here. You can also support me on Patreon, Ko-fi.com, or send me a super thanks here on YouTube. Thank you guys so much for your support and for watching this video, and with that, I hope I'll see you next time. Tschüss!